From South Carolina Public Radio, this is the South Carolina Lede. I'm your host, Gavin Jackson, and this episode was recorded on July 12, 2024 from South Carolina Public Radio Studios here in Columbia. On this episode of The Lede, and in preparation for a more nationally focused week, we bring you some of the highlights and machinations of the 2024 campaign trail from President Joe Biden's make or break week at the NATO summit and the subsequent press conferences where he attempted to allay concerns over his age. We hear from one of his top allies, Congressman Jim Clyburn, and also hear what former President Donald Trump is saying on the trail. And the governor talks about the upcoming convention. Speaking of which, we have a programming note. We will be bringing you complete coverage starting Monday from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. We will have daily podcast coverage telling you what's on tap each day, interviews with South Carolina's top politicos, recapping highlights from the day before, and giving you behind-the-scenes insight that no other South Carolina outlet is doing. We'll have daily newscasts on air, social media videos on our platforms, rolling web updates on southcarolinapublicradio.org, and a dedicated episode recapping all of it on This Week in South Carolina. So get ready. Check out the SC Lead Pod Instagram account. She'll be up and running. Also, just so you guys know, we will not have a wind down today because this is a little full episode, but we also want to hear from you, 803-563-7169. That's our way of hearing from you guys and getting to know what's on your mind, what you're thinking about. We try not to keep it political because it is our little break from the news, but there's a lot going on out there. If you want to express your concerns, let us know, 803-563-7169. Leave us your name, where you're calling from, and what's on your mind. It was a big week in Washington with President Joe Biden hosting the annual NATO summit with world leaders gathered to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Strategic Security Alliance that has been reinvigorated following the Russian invasion in Ukraine more than 2 years ago. But the importance of the meeting and the results of it, including more pledged funding from NATO countries in support of Ukraine and the start of F-16 transfers from NATO countries, comes as Ukraine regains an upper hand in the war thanks to funding from the United States and allies. Of course, a lot of that was overshadowed as Biden and his administration continue to do damage control following his poor debate performance 2 weeks ago, which has spurred calls for him to step aside from prominent voices within his own party. A press conference at the end of the summit on Thursday, meant to allay the growing voices and concerns, didn't seem to do much in the way of doing that, with frequent fumbles, tangents, and confused names, including when he referred to Donald Trump as his vice president in his first answer. Now listen to this question from Reuters reporter Jeff Mason and Biden's response.
Mr. President, your political future has hung over the NATO summit a little bit this week. Speaker Pelosi made a point of suggesting that your decision on whether to stay in the race was still open. George Clooney and a handful of lawmakers have called on you to step aside. Reuters is reporting tonight that UAW leadership is concerned about your ability to win.
UAW just endorsed me, but go ahead.
Thank you. My question for you is, how are you incorporating these developments into your decision to stay? And separately, what concerns do you have about Vice President Harris's ability to beat Donald Trump if she were at the top of the ticket?
Look, I wouldn't have picked Vice President Trump to be vice president, but I think she was not qualified to be president. So let's start there. Number one. The fact is that the consideration is that I think I'm the most qualified person to run for president. I beat him once, and I will beat him again. Secondly, the idea, I served in the Senate a long time. The idea that senators and congressmen running for office worry about the ticket is not unusual. And I might add, there are at least 5 presidents running or incumbent presidents who had lower numbers than I have now, later in the campaign. So there's a long way to go in this campaign. And so I'm just going to keep moving. And because, look, I got more work to do. We've got more work to finish.
This came after his press conference with other NATO leaders and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in which he mistakenly referred to him as President Putin.
I've said before, Russia will not prevail in this war. Ukraine will prevail in this war, and we'll stand with them every single step of the way. That's what the compact says, loudly and clearly. And now I want to hand it over to the president of Ukraine, who has as much courage as he has determination. Ladies and gentlemen, President Putin. President Putin. We're going to beat President Putin. President Zelensky. I'm so focused on beating Putin, we got to worry about it. Anyway, Mr. President.
I'm better.
You are a hell of a lot better.
But back to his individual press conference, the line of questioning over his age and abilities was lightly peppered with national security questions for over more than 50 minutes. The press conference was carried live by all major national and several international news outlets. At the end of the presser, Biden stood at the podium as reporters shouted questions at him, including NBC News' Peter Alexander, who followed up to Biden's first response over mixing up Vice President Kamala Harris and Trump. Take a listen.
Respectfully, earlier you misspoke in your opening answer. You referred to Vice President Harris as Vice President Trump. Right now, Donald Trump is using that to mock your age and your memory. How do you combat that criticism from tonight?
Listen to him.
Not exactly a comeback there for Biden. He was also asked about his cognitive abilities and noted that he has been evaluated by a neurologist as recently as February and said he'll know when it's time to step down.
I've taken 3 significant and intense neurological exams by a neurologist. In each case, as recently as February. And they say I'm in good shape, okay? Although I do have a little problem with my left foot because it's not as sensitive because I broke my foot and didn't wear the boot. But I'm good. I'm tested every single day about my neurological capacity to do decisions I make every day. You talk to my staff, all of you talk to my staff. Sometimes my staff talks a lot. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you have them telling you that all the major ideas we've undertaken haven't been in part initiated by me. I remember when the staff and I said, I'm going to go to South Korea, we're going to get the chip. What are you doing? I'm going to get Japan and Korea back together again after essentially having hostilities toward one another since the end of World War II. I'm going to move and see that we can expand it. You know, the only thing age does is help you with it, creates a little bit of wisdom if you pay attention. And so the point I'm making is, I think it's important that if the neurologist tells me he thinks I need another exam, and by the way, I've laid every bit of the record out, hadn't hidden a thing. You ought to ask Trump for his, okay? I laid it all out. And every single day I'm surrounded by good docs. If they think there's a problem, I promise you, or even if they don't think it's a problem, they think I should have a neurological exam again, I'll do it. But no one's suggesting that to me now. And I'll ask you another question. No matter what I did, no one's going to be satisfied.
The 81-year-old Biden still recalled details of pressing foreign policy issues from Israel to Ukraine, prompting some Democrats to say he still has it. But when stringing together a coherent sentence instead of, an entire speech that also motivates people, well, those are two different things, especially when the party is looking for a candidate to get people fired up to vote up and down the ballot. Despite the performance, many Democrats are publicly asking for Biden to step down in favor of someone else. In fact, 17 members of Congress have called for him to stand down as of our taping, according to Politico. But one of his strongest allies, Congressman Jim Clyburn, well, he's standing by his man. Clyburn was on the Today Show with Craig Melvin Friday morning, reaffirming his support for Biden.
Well, those of us who are real close watchers of Joe Biden, we do know that he sometimes mangles words and phrases, but all of that is almost natural for people who grew up stuttering, and they do focus a little more. And when you focus a little more, you tend to lose the flow.
But you're not saying that what we've seen from this president over the last few weeks is just a function of him stuttering. I mean, it's more than that.
he doesn't stutter now. He is still working to overcome the stuttering of his childhood. I've been around that condition for a long time, and I know exactly how it operates. But he has one of the best minds that I've ever been around. And the people who've been around him will tell you that. And so I would hope that we will focus on the substance of this man rather than these sometimes misspoken words and phrases and how he has run this country.
Clyburn has been a Biden ride or die and was a major part in him securing the nomination back in 2020 when he won the South Carolina primary in a landslide after subpar performances in Iowa and New Hampshire. While Biden overcame those odds back then and defeated then-President Donald Trump that November, much has changed.
The conversation should focus on the record of this administration, on the alternative to his election, and let Joe Biden continue to make his own decisions about his future. He's earned that right, and I am going to give him that much respect. If he decides to change his mind later on, then we will respond to that. We have until the 19th of August to open our convention, and so I would hope that we will spend our time now focusing on the record that we will lay out for the American people, remind the American people of what is in store for them if Project 2025 were to become a law in any form. That is where our focus ought to be.
But Congressman, again, how is this a candidate? How is this a candidacy or candidate that can remain viable if you literally have a Democrat every day calling on him to drop out of the race, down ballot Democrats who are going to be answering questions day in and day out about the president's mental acuity? How is that a campaign that can be successful?
Well, Joe Biden is focused on the future of this country. And I always say the best predictor of future performance is past behavior. Let's continue to compare the past behavior of Joe Biden as to the past behavior of his opponent, Donald Trump, and let that be a guide to our reactions going forward.
You just heard Clyburn say he supports Biden, but add, quote, if he decides to change his mind later on, then we'll respond to that, quote. That was Clyburn there. Now, Clyburn's support likely won't be enough to help Biden this go around, but what happens if there were to be a change at the top of the Democratic Party ticket, you might wonder? Well, it's easier said than done when it comes to replacing the nominee. The New York Times produced a flow chart on how this could go down, so let me just recap that for you. Now, if Biden stays in the race, there will be a virtual nomination vote as soon as July 21st, where nearly all of the roughly 4,000 delegates are pledged to him. The Democratic National Convention is August 19th. If he were to drop out by then a candidate needs signatures from at least 300 delegates to appear on the convention ballot. That would be voted upon at the convention, and whoever wins the majority would be nominated. If no candidate reaches a majority in that first round, then some 700 superdelegates would vote in subsequent rounds. Now, if Biden were to drop out after the convention, then the Democratic National Committee would choose a new nominee. That committee includes state party leaders and members allocated by state population, and it could also give the impression of a smoke-filled room of leaders picking the nominee, which would be a bit of a questionable look. Now, states begin to finalize their ballots in late August through September, with the first mail-in ballots sent out starting September 6th, and early voting in some states beginning September 20th. Should any change occur, there are lawsuits that would likely arise and questions about fundraising. Now, the Biden White House will get a little bit of a reprieve next week with the eyes of the political world focused on the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. But that doesn't mean Republicans won't be talking about it. Now, for some more context on how the country is feeling right now, let's look at the most recent PBS NewsHour Marist NPR poll that was conducted this week and came out Friday, July 12th. Data! Among registered voters, Biden leads Trump 50% to 48%. That shrinks to 50% to 49% if Biden were to be replaced by Harris. But when those voters were asked who they think will win, 58% said Trump and 40% said Biden, so not a very big vote of confidence there. Now, here's one thing voters agree on. They're not sure either man is mentally fit enough to be president. Greatest country in the world there, folks. Now, just 36% of registered voters think Biden has the mental fitness to serve as president. 50% say Trump has a mental fitness. So that's where we are right now, folks. But speaking of Trump and the campaign trail, he was rallying in Florida this week, nothing like Florida in July, and said some things that also, were kind of questionable. In fact, he challenged Biden to another debate and a golf match.
I'm also officially challenging Crooked Joe to an 18-hole golf match right here. On Doral Blue Monster, considered one of the greatest tournament golf courses anywhere in the world, one of the great courses of the world. It will be among the most watched sporting events in history, maybe bigger than the Ryder Cup or even the Masters.
Okay, now that would be fascinating, but also not really relevant in terms of solutions to the country and the world's problems, but, that's what it is. Of course, Trump, who is 78, just 3 years younger than President Biden, continued his praise for the fictional movie character Hannibal Lecter, played by Sir Anthony Hopkins in the 1992 Oscar award-winning Best Picture Silence of the Lambs, and somehow ties it into immigration issues.
Did anyone ever see the lovely movie Silence of the Lambs? Did you see it? Did you ever hear of Hannibal Lecter? He was a lovely man. He would love to have you for dinner. He will take you. You had many people for dinner. Well, we have a lot of people coming in. They always say, oh, that's terrible, that Trump would say. He is rambling about Hannibal Lecter. No, I'm not rambling. We are allowing people from insane asylums and mental institutions into our country by the tens of thousands. And they're closing them down in other countries. The cost savings?
Trump also spoke about the conditions at the rally, and I can attest to such conditions since I spent the entire day in sunny, hot downtown Pickens last July 4th at his rally. People were roasting out there. Many didn't have sufficient water or shade. In fact, people were falling out with repeated calls for medics. Many times, people would turn to the media riser after having scorned us, shouting for medics as if we have any control over emergency services. Of course, that's not what we do there. But unlike that 2023 Pickens rally, Trump was covered in sweat down in Doral, Florida, which he mentions here.
It's only 103 degrees out here. So, they built all these, they call them, sir, we have many water spots. I said, what about one for me? Do I have one? I don't have one, Marco. They gave water spots. Everybody has, they call it a water spot. Where water comes out, they don't have anything for me. I'm being drenched up here.
And Trump also mentioned that he would take over the city of Washington if reelected, which is kind of next to impossible unless the Constitution was to be amended to give the president, not Congress, the power to oversee the federal city. Hey, it could always be an official act. Who knows?
We will take over the horribly run capital of our nation in Washington, D.C., and clean it up, renovate it, and rebuild our capital city so that it's no longer a nightmare of murder and crime, but rather it will become the most beautiful capital anywhere in the world. Right now, if you leave Florida, oh, let's go, darling. Let's look at the Jefferson Memorial. Let's look at the Washington Monument. Let's look at some of the beautiful scenes, and you end up getting shot, mugged, raped. We're going to take over our capital, and we're going to run it tough and smart, and we're going to beautify it.
Now, sorry for going so national, especially since we're going to give you a week's worth of national news focused through a South Carolina lens. But there is a lot going on, and chances are you're having a hard time keeping up with it or don't want to. So I figured I'd just give you a nice big helping of it. Speaking of the convention, like we said at the top, we will be out there in force bringing you the latest from Milwaukee. So let's briefly talk about the convention. What is it? Well, it's a giant pep rally, essentially. It is where a political party officially nominates its party's candidate for president and vice president. Now, remember, you run through that whole primary process where the early states and other states vote, and that's when the candidates win delegates. And through that process, the nominee becomes clear, making the convention itself a bit perfunctory, though that could be different this year for the Democrats, like we said. But for example, in the Republican primary, a candidate needed to secure 1,215 delegates to become the nominee. South Carolina has 50 delegates. Trump won 47 of them, and former Governor Nikki Haley won 3. Haley only secured 97 delegates overall to Trump's 2,243, so very obvious that he became the nominee. And Haley said earlier this week that she has released her 97 delegates and encouraged them to vote for Trump. Again, not entirely necessary since Trump overwhelmingly secured the nomination, but that's a step toward reconciliation that former candidates typically make. However, Haley said she was not invited to the convention, and her spokeswoman Cheney Denton said that the former United Nations ambassador is fine with that. Meanwhile, Trump told News 12 New York that, quote, "I think she's going to be on our team because we have a lot of the same ideas, the same thoughts. I appreciate what she did. You know, we had a nasty campaign. It was pretty nasty. But she's a very capable person, and I'm sure she's going to be on our team in some form. Absolutely." That was Trump there talking to News 12 New York about Nikki Haley, who served in his cabinet. Now, besides the nomination, the convention is also a time where the party solidifies its party platform, which outlines the party's beliefs and policy positions. Governor Henry McMaster, who is one of South Carolina's 50 delegates, told reporters this week about his plans for the party in Milwaukee. Unlike the 2016 convention, where then Lieutenant Governor McMaster, who was the first statewide elected official to endorse Trump, got to nominate him at that convention, well, McMaster's not doing any speaking parts this year.
I think it's going to be exciting. I think the excitement, I think the excitement's been building for months. And I know people are excited to go, and I know that there are a lot of Americans that are looking for a change, and we believe that President Trump is going to be that change. It is very exciting to see this day coming. But these conventions are always very interesting. I think on the Republican side this time, I think we'll all be going in the same direction. I think the Democrats are going to have their hands full at their convention because of all these circumstances that have been going on recently.
Stay tuned next week. We'll bring you everything you need to know to make sense of the convention in Milwaukee.
Actually, it's pronounced Milwaukee.
All right, y'all, thank you for listening to the pod. Show us your appreciation by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or a voicemail at 803-563-7169. You can stay up to date with the latest news on scetv.org and southcarolinapublicradio.org, and don't forget to support your local newspapers. The South Carolina Lead is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. Our producer is A.T. Shire. Amy Crouch is our supervising producer. Sean Birch is our executive producer. This podcast is produced with support from PRX and is made possible in part by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, as well as listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. For the South Carolina Lead, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.